There are some TikTok videos that I've seen recently, and I've seen this also on Facebook, where women will say marriage has historically been slavery for women, and men will come back and say, no, it hasn't been. And one particular creator, Levi Washington, said, no, marriage was a protection for women because prior to police and other legal authorities being widespread, women were in danger. They needed men to protect them through marriage. So, this is what's called benevolent sexism. It's saying, yes, this thing, marriage, can be abused, but it's a good thing. And it's always been a good thing. And it started as a good thing. And anyone saying that it wasn't a good thing is overlooking all the good that it does. Now, my rebuttal to this is to say, first off, there are different types of marriages. Now, marriage has existed for many, many, many millennia, and it existed in matriarchal and egalitarian societies. But when colonizers came into those societies and they saw those marriages, they, of course, didn't like them. And of course, they went very far into trying to get these indigenous peoples to let go of their beliefs and adopt patriarchal ones. And they were largely successful in most parts of the world. We have very few places that are still matriarchal, matrilineal, or egalitarian. Most of the world is now patriarchal. So, starting about 500 BC or so, going into the present world, we've had marriage that's been largely patriarchal. And that is a system where women were legally considered property. That's a fact. In America, that was called the rule of coverture, which meant when a woman got married, not only her body, her time, her labor, and any earnings that she would earn through her labor all became the property of her husband. So to say that marriage was a way to protect your land, your cattle from being stolen prior to police forces and other legal remedies is a moot point, because if you were single and you had this property as a woman and you got married, you lost the property to your husband. And he could do whatever he wanted to do with it and with you, because you also lost your legal personhood. So to say that women would get married to protect their property makes no sense, because you don't get married to protect property and then give yourself over as that property as well. Makes no sense at all. Okay. Also, let's go a little bit further. So we know that these patriarchal laws started way back then and continued into at least 1839, 1882, 1900 is when women started to get some legal personhood, depending on the state. Okay. And marital rape was not outlawed in all states until 1993. So that was, again, the idea that men had access to their wives' bodies without recourse, that they could do whatever they wanted to them. And going back a little further, I didn't mention this before, but I should mention that there were men who were renting out their wives, selling their wives, leasing their wives, because again, that wife was considered property and he was able to do with her as he saw fit. So again, the whole slavery idea, because you could do the same thing with a slave. Okay. Now, let's fast forward a little bit and let's talk about, again, this whole idea that marriage was protection. So many women didn't want to get married and became spinsters, or they became old maids, or whatever you want to call them, that around 1450, some men came up with a brilliant idea for people that they were craving their land, their property, their assets. We had what was called witch hysteria. And between 1450 and 1750, that's a 300-year period, 60,000 women were accused, tried, convicted, and many were killed as witches. And when you were accused of witchcraft, guess what happened? You lost your property. It was given over to a lot of times your accusers as a payment for whatever pain and suffering you supposedly had burdened them with. And out of that 60,000, about 75% of that 60,000 women were single. So these were single women who had access to their own land, their own cattle, their own property, their own money and assets. And those assets were seized through calling them witches. Now, if marriage was such a great thing, why didn't these women just get married to protect themselves from the terror of going through this? Obviously, it couldn't have been such a good thing if they would rather risk this ability to be called a witch and be prosecuted and terminated rather than get married. So again, that's not a great thing. We also had women who were accused of being mentally unstable, and they were put into asylums because they were too headstrong. This also happened to married women, but it also happened a lot to single women who didn't want to conform to what their families wanted. And to go a little bit deeper, a lot of people, when they come up with these um, salutes to marriage, they act as if marriage was universal. And sometimes there was a lot of marriage in the past. But if we go back into the past, and I've said this before, marriage was begun under patriarchy is really something for the elites. People who had property, people who had land, who had cattle, they needed to pass it down through the father's line. They needed to know who the father was. And so that was why there was marriage. You had a legal contract, you could track who was the father, and then the line of succession was, legitimate and protected. Um, but when we talk about marriage, we also should realize that in the 1800s, when they started keeping these records, the marriage rate was about 50%. In fact, the highest record for marriages that I have found, the highest year, was not in the ancient past, was actually 1949. 78.8% of the population was married. Fast forward to 2020, and 5.1% of the population was married. Okay, so we're talking about a drastic drop. The marriage rate has drastically dropped. 5.1 of every 1,000 people in that year were married in America. So, marriage is not ubiquitous. It's not everywhere. Everybody's not doing it. Everybody doesn't see it as this great and amazing thing. Some people do, and that's great for them. But to dispute marriage as a form of slavery is inaccurate. And to say that marriage was salvation for people who needed to protect their land and their cattle and their other assets is a little ridiculous because, again, a woman wouldn't choose that if she's going to become property herself. And also, I want to stress that colonists and colonizers looked at the marriages that were here prior to patriarchy and said, oh my gosh, those women have too much freedom. Oh my gosh, we need to create a different form of marriage because that gives women too much say so. That gives women too much autonomy, too much independence. So the thing is, marriage doesn't have to be oppressive. There have been many, many models of egalitarian and matriarchal and matrilineal marriages all throughout history. That's not what patriarchy has wanted. Patriarchy has wanted a different type of marriage that put men in power and made women submit. And that was by choice. It was not something that needed to happen to protect women, to protect property, to protect inheritance, any of that. None of that had to happen. It was a choice. And just like slavery was a choice that some people made, and many forms of slavery have happened throughout the world, and chattel slavery was the worst. So when it comes to patriarchy, we see that patriarchy, capitalism, greed, all those things can go in hand with one another to try to choose the worst of the worst way to do things. Chattel slavery and marriage as slavery. And that's a choice.